we're going to start from the very beginning today with chess, assuming that you don't know anything about it. I have here in the color white the different pieces. You do have multiples of some of them. You certainly don't have a multiple of the king or the queen. You have two of each of these three pieces, which I'll describe, and then you have a whole rank of pawns. So the pawn can only move forward. He cannot move sideways. He cannot go backwards. He can only move towards your opponent. The pawn can capture at a diagonal. So if black's pawn was there and it was white's move, he can capture the black pawn. But it's important to note that if the black pawn is here, he can't capture because he cannot capture sideways. He can't move sideways. And if the black pawn is here, neither one can capture. So those guys are kind of at a stalemate there, and you'll use that. Then we have the bishop. The bishop can move in diagonals. The bishop stays on whatever color it starts on, right? This bishop, since it can only move in diagonals, will never be on a white square. You have the rook, which can move sideways or up and down, never diagonal. So each of these two pieces can do what the other one can't. And together, they make up the same capabilities as the queen. The queen can go side to side, front to back, diagonal. It can go side and get on a white square, unlike the bishop that stays on whatever color it's on. So the queen is the most diverse piece, with the exception of, I would say, one thing: the queen cannot jump. None of these pieces can jump. This piece can jump. This piece kind of has an odd movement. This is the knight, and he moves 2 up and 1 over. And you can do that, or it can be said he moves 1 diagonal and 1 forward. But every time he makes this kind of L shape in whatever configuration. So from this position here, I could move my knight 2 forward and 1 over, or I can move it 2 forward and 1 over. I can jump anything in the way, no problem. Or I could come 2 down and 1 over. I could come 2 down and 1 up. So there are a number of ways that this piece moves kind of odd, and it's a good one to use to confuse the opponent, because it can cover so many different squares that are not as apparent as, like, when you see this guy and he's right up the alley from this, your eye easily registers that this piece can take this piece. Say you had a piece in the way and you knew that it was protecting it. As soon as this piece gets taken or kills diagonally or something, it's easy to witness that this one is in trouble here. But with the knight, it's easy to lose sight of it, that he's threatening this piece. So you have the knight. The knight's the only one that can jump. It can kill anything on any square it lands on. Anyone can kill anyone else. The pawn is the most limited because he can only move 1 at a time, with the exception of, then I have this board tweaked around a little, so we'd be set up like this. Let me just show you how one corner would be. This is how they go. The queen gets her color. Generally, you go by height. If the queen gets her color, the king's here, and then I've left out the other half for now. And then conceptually, okay, you have royalty. You have the bishop, the church, right? And that would have kind of a closer ear to the king than the knight. Okay, and then the rook is kind of like the castle walls, or, the edge of your empire. So conceptually it works, or just go by height and know that the queen gets her color. The first move that the pawn makes, okay, it can either be 1 forward. Remember, you can only move forward, can't move backward. Or on his first move, on your opening move, any of the pawns can move 2 forward. After that, they can't ever move 2. It's only 1, and can only kill diagonally. Right? Again, the rook can move straight, so he can capture here. If the rook's out here and this guy's over here, he can capture here. But if the rook's here and the pawn is at the diagonal, he cannot capture this one because the rook cannot move diagonally, but the pawn can capture diagonally. And the knight, from his starting position, he can move either here, or he can move here, or if you've got this pawn out of the way, he can move here because it's 2 over, 1 up, or 1 up, 2 over. It's got that L shape to it. So if there was a black pawn here, the knight could capture the black pawn coming out of its starting position. If it were here, it could capture it like that. Now, having said that, if the pawn is here, either place that this knight moves up here, it's threatened, because the knight cannot take diagonally. The knight can only move in that L shape. But the pawn can take the knight diagonally, and a lot of people would say that's not a good trade to make, but it kind of depends. So with the pawn there, either place this knight tries to come out, he's threatened. Okay, the only move he can really make is here to stay safe from him. Another thing that we'll get into, and this is a strategy that a lot of people like to use, I definitely encourage it. These start in this position, and again, I don't have all the pieces on the board, but just looking at the back rank, if the rook and the king have not moved from their original position, they can do a little move that's called castling, where in one move, and this is the only time you get to do this in chess, you can move 2 pieces. See, and the way you do that is the king goes 2 towards the rook, and then the rook goes just on the other side of the king. It's a little different on the other side because you have the queen, so the rook travels farther. But just in your mind, the king cannot have moved from his original position. He goes 2 towards the rook, and then you put the rook on the other side. That's called castling. The only thing about that particular move is 2 things. 1, they cannot have moved from their original position. 2, here's a queen from, say, this position. Say black just moved. This queen is now threatening the king, right? Because she can move on diagonals or up and down or side to side. She just can't jump, that's all. So either the king has to move. Now, once he's done that, you can't do the castling thing, right? You can't do that. You can't move the king and then move back and then castle. You can't. You can only castle if they haven't moved from their original spots, those 2 pieces, the rook and the king. One of the things that can happen when a king is in check, as the queen has him right now, is he can interpose. And that means he puts another piece in the way, right? So now the knight has interposed, and in such a way as well where if the queen decides to take the knight, because it can, then the king can just take the queen. So now you've traded a knight for their queen, which a lot of people would consider a very good trade because the queen is such a diverse piece. The interposing comes into play where now I've protected the king, and say she's not even going to try for the knight because she doesn't want to be taken by the king, right? So now I've successfully managed to keep these 2 pieces, the king and the rook, in their original position. Now they're not in check. The king is not in check, so he can castle with the rook, right? Now the queen cannot move here because the king will take her. The queen cannot move here because this pawn will take her on the diagonal. The queen cannot move here because then this queen will take her. Those are the kind of situations that you're trying to set up, and the way that the different pieces can protect each other. If she comes here to check the king, I can take her with the castle. 2, you move the king. 3, you interpose. Say the knight is here. You would move the knight in between them.